Thank you all for coming. My name is Paul Irvin. I'm with the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management, and I'm here with Ed McClanahan of the Office of State Budget and Management, and we're going to be talking to you about the economic impact of Hurricane Florence. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge Bonnie Queen of the Office of State Budget and Management for her important contributions on this work. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to attend today. So Hurricane Florence made landfall on September 14th with a storm surge up to 10 feet at Wrightsville Beach. The slow-moving hurricane produced rainfall up to nearly 36 inches, and many rivers surpassed previous flood records. Just 3 weeks following the storm, the Office of State Budget and Management estimated total damage from Hurricane Florence at over $12 billion. These estimates were later revised to over $16 billion worth of damage, of which $4.6 billion was estimated to come from economic losses to non-agricultural businesses. Recently, NOAA has reported the cost of Florence to North Carolina to be more than both Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Floyd combined in real terms. These rapid damage assessments have been crucial in informing budget processes for recovery efforts using state and federal funds. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on the business losses from Hurricane Florence. I'm going to start with a general overview of economic modeling of disaster impacts, and we'll develop a common language on how we describe costs and losses. Then we will work through our model for estimating business losses from Hurricane Florence, and we'll conclude with results and a discussion of some areas we are working on improving. So numerous economic models exist to support emergency management, ranging from planning and hazard mitigation to response and recovery. Here is an overview of some of the key models, and we provided some references at the end for anyone who wants to get into details of any of these models. But in this presentation, we are going to be focusing on assessing the economic losses to support recovery planning. So we're going to be using a GDP framework to estimate output losses from the storm. Results are going to be in terms of output revenue and value-added gross state product. This is different from a cost-benefit analysis framework. For example, while rebuilding a house adds to GDP, consumer welfare may only be restored to pre-storm levels, and we don't incorporate any psychological costs or other similar types of damages, although they may be large. Furthermore, our analysis guides recovery efforts, but excludes analyzing the impact of such recovery efforts. So before diving into the model, we need to establish a common language about costs and losses. We'll begin with stock losses. So stock losses are all the damages to physical capital and infrastructure, or rather all the property damage. These are generally estimated from models using damage curves or damage functions, and such damages can be compared to local assessments when they're available. And these are the damages often reported in news media, although there is a trend towards reporting both stock and flow losses. So sticking with stock losses, here's an example from our Flood Inundation and Mapping Alert Network, our fiman website. This is a gauge in Fayetteville on the Cape Fear River. This is what the area near this river looks like in normal times. So under a flood scenario, for example, here at a stage around 58 feet, we start to see structures underwater. Here you can see the blue is the river flood, and you can see some of these yellow and red structures inside of the flooding. Provided first floor elevation of the structure, we can determine the expected flood depth of the building. We can then use damage curves from existing studies that convert flood depth into structure and content damages in terms of pre-flood reconstruction costs. Here you can see at this flood level, the highlighted structure is expected to suffer over $123,000 worth of damage, and around this gauge, there's 10 buildings damaged at a cost of over $450,000. So keeping that in mind, here's the Hurricane Florence floodplain based on observed rainfall during the storm. So it was massive, covering the entire coast and the most of the northeast of the state, or the southeast of the state. So zooming into the Florence floodplain, back to that area that I just showed, around Fayetteville, you can see the extent of the flood was massive in this area, and it extended over most of the state. In total, we estimated over 600 million in physical damage to non-agricultural business structures and content from flooding and wind. And these estimates are likely a lower bound because they only include damages from the mapped floodplain. Of course, there were damages outside of the floodplain from wind, debris, and stormwater flooding. And extrapolating from the Department of Insurance reports, we expect total damages, including damages outside of the floodplain, to be over $1.2 billion. So those were stock damages, or rather the physical damages to structures. But these damages cause another type of damage, which we refer to as flow losses. Flow losses are the economic activity lost due to physical damage to capital and infrastructure. For example, a business might not be able to operate because of flooded facilities, damaged equipment, lack of utilities, closed highways, and so on. Businesses that can't operate due to direct impacts from the storm can affect businesses downstream in their supply chain, causing spillover or indirect flow losses. Additionally, induced losses can result from income losses to workers in business who now have less money to spend on other goods and services. This further impacts other sectors. In sum, these flow losses provide a more comprehensive picture on economic output and the economy because they translate physical damages into economic losses. However, flow losses are generally not available and must be estimated. So before getting into estimating flow losses, here's an example to drill the point home. Here is a plant in a flood zone, the picture on your left, that can't operate due to the direct damage and disruptions from the flood. These direct damages cause direct production losses, which spill over to assembly plants outside of the flood zone that cannot work without the parts they ordered. This is the picture on your right. Thus, the flood has caused direct property damage, which caused direct flow losses, which caused indirect flow losses, and may create induced losses from lower incomes and to workers and owners. So putting this all together, here's a simplified model of the economic impact of a disaster. Physical damages cause direct and indirect losses, which accrue over time. Eventually, the economy will recover, and the total economic losses due to this disaster can be estimated as Area A. This is that red triangle. Inflows from recovery assistance can speed recovery and may even provide a potential recovery stimulus, which is the Area B, the yellow area. The net economic impact of the disaster is then the difference between Area A and Area B. While our estimates consider some of the recovery time from business resiliency, we don't consider recovery programs and recovery stimuli. So really, we are looking at Area A in this presentation. But of course, there are a number of challenges, even when restricting our focus to just the losses. So with that, I'm going to let you hear from Ed McClanahan of the Office of State Budget and Management, who's going to guide you through the data and methods we use to overcome many of these challenges to estimate credible business losses from Florence.
All right, thanks, Paul. Okay, so first I just want to reiterate that our goal for the purposes here for this presentation and our analysis is that we're estimating the economic impact of Hurricane Florence on total economic output, which is those flow losses that Paul mentioned. So our analysis, we started with estimating output losses directly caused by Hurricane Florence due to business closing or operating at reduced capacity. So we then incorporated those direct loss estimates by industry and geography into an input-output model to estimate the indirect and induced losses. And Paul mentioned those a little bit, but by indirect losses, I'm specifically referring to the upstream supply chain effects. So if an auto plant that's closed due to flooding will be it'll be unable to purchase tires or engine parts from its suppliers that are outside the flood zone and not as otherwise directly affected by the storm. So the direct losses and those indirect losses are then going to lead to income losses for workers and for business owners, which is then going to reduce their spending on consumer goods. And those are those induced losses that we've mentioned. And then to account for the variance in industry concentration and other economic factors across the state, we utilized a multi-region input-output model. So the economic impacts of hurricanes and other weather-related disasters vary substantially, not just due to the intensity of a given storm, but also where those events occur. So there's considerable geographic variance in total output by county, as you can see in the top left map, with the lighter color areas representing much more economic output than the darker colored areas. There's a lot of variance in terms of industry concentrations, as illustrated in the top right map, looking at the concentration of retail sectors across the county. And there's also a variance in terms of the vulnerability to flooding. And you can see that in the bottom map, which is the share of buildings that are in a share of housing units that are in the floodplain. Now here we're trying to show how the differential impacts of the storm across different areas of the state. How you can look at how the rainfall amounts on the left map, with the darker areas being higher rainfall amounts, they mapped pretty well to the different levels of disaster declaration from FEMA. So seeing the rainfall amounts directly translating into different levels of disaster. Now, because we don't have detailed information about specific businesses and how they're impacted by the storm, so for instance, we can't tell that this business on Main Street that was closed for 5 days and it was operating at half capacity for another 3 days versus a building down the street on Maple Street was open for after 2 days. We don't have that kind of data, so we have to make our best estimates. And to make our estimates tractable, we grouped the counties into 5 different groups based on measurable criteria. And some of these criteria were based on FEMA and state designations, such as eligibility for individual assistance from FEMA or whether there were mandatory or voluntary evacuations. Some criteria were based on measurable impacts, like the number of days that schools were closed in a given county. And some of the criteria were based on model-based impacts. So, for instance, the property damage is a share of the total assessed value in a given county. Now, for estimating the direct losses, we undertook a 4-step approach. The first step involved determining the peak disruption to businesses in the hardest hit areas, that critical impact area. And then the peak disruption, the way we determined that was it was guided by county level data on utility outages. The next step was to account for how the peak level of disruption would vary by industry. So there's some industries that are more resilient and able to continue production or at least collect revenue during the storm and during the immediate aftermath. But there are other types of industries that would be almost completely shut down. And furthermore, there's also industries that would be better able to compensate for partial shutdown or a shutdown during the storm by shifting some production to after the storm. But not all industries were able to do that. Now, looking at a couple industries at either end of the spectrum there, we have the construction industry at one end, where they're not typically able to operate very much during the heavily inclement weather. And even when they are able to come back into business, they basically have to shift their entire production schedule back. They can't easily make up for the losses that they endured during the storm. The information industry, on the other hand, that's an industry that's pretty largely subscription-based and where a lot of the work is done electronically and can be done remotely. So they're not necessarily going to face a big direct impact, and a lot of the impact they do face, they could make up for after the storm. So once we had an estimate of the peak disruption, accounting for those industry differences, our third step was to develop a time path for disruption before, during, and after the storm. This time path was based on county level data on things like evacuations, utility outages, road blockages, modeled property damages, school closures, and various other factors. And then finally, we scaled the disruption time paths we developed for the critical area to the 4 other severity groups. So here we have some of the factors that went into our disruption estimates and time paths. So on the left, you can see time paths of power outages in the different groups. In the top right, we have a table showing average school closures across the different county groupings. And in the bottom right, you can see our modeled property damage as a share of county assessed value. On the bottom right, you can see that all of those varied pretty substantially across the different groupings. Right now, on this slide, we've illustrated those disruption time paths I was just discussing. And so for the critical area, you can see there was a pretty quick ramp up from the pre-storm preparations up to the 45% disruption during the peak of the storm, and that gradually diminished over the course of the next 6 weeks as utilities came back online, as flooding subsided and cleared out roadways, and folks were able to get out and clear out some of the other impediments to businesses reopening. So then we took those time paths for all the different severity groups and we converted those to a single disruption factor for each of the 5 different severity categories. And that factor was denominated in GDP days. So for example, the disruption in the critical impact area, it was equivalent to losing about 6 days of GDP for all the counties that were in that critical impact group. And same about 2.3 GDP days in the high impact areas and so on. Now, for implementing our multi-region model, we further group the regions into a critical high area and a medium to minimal area so that we can make our modeling a bit more tractable. Now, as the blue arrows show on the map, we had direct impact on some businesses that then led to indirect impacts on other businesses within that region. And then the black arrows show how directly impacted businesses within a given region also had indirect impacts on businesses outside the region. And that occurred in both directions, from the highly impacted areas and from the less impacted areas. Now, the benefit of using a multi-regional model like this is that it's better able to account for a lot of the economic differences that, across the regions of the state, while also still capturing a lot of those interlinkages between the industries within the state. Now here we have the results of our economic impact modeling. So the total effects you can see in the bottom line, where we saw about 30,000 lost job years from Hurricane Florence, about 1.3 billion in lost labor income, about 2.3 billion in lost value added, and more than 4.6 billion in total lost economic output. And as you can see, the direct impacts, those accounted for the majority of the overall impacts, but the indirect and induced impacts were still quite considerable. Now, looking at more at the big picture, it's pretty clear that the current flood mapping and damage assessment capabilities and the coordination across agencies at different levels of government with different capabilities and different roles, that all proved really invaluable for quickly enabling the state and its partners to put together a comprehensive plan for recovery, to leverage the necessary local, state, and federal resources, and to implement programs to launch the recovery process. And we're also confident that the methodology we developed and implemented in very short order resulted in useful and reliable information that really guided the allocation of resources for recovery. Now, looking ahead, however, we do see some areas where there is potential improvement. So first, we could improve the accuracy of our impact estimates through better coordination of geocoding across various databases. So for example, it would be ideal to be able to match specific buildings in the statewide building footprint to microdata from the quarterly census of employment and wages, so that we can map those specific damages to specific buildings to the businesses that occupy those buildings, which would make for better impact estimates. And there's also considerable benefit from using post-disaster assessments to improve analyses of economic loss, such as through improving our modeling of damages outside the flood zone, using microdata to validate industry-specific impact assumptions, and developing from those evidence-based formulas for converting model damages, which we're able to get on short order, to estimates of production losses. Now, in the long term, we think that further study of the economic impact of hurricanes could really help guide policy to make businesses and individuals more resilient to the impacts of future storms. And here we have those references that Paul mentioned before, and just wanted to direct you specifically to the OSBM websites, the second from bottom, where we have a much more comprehensive damage and needs assessment that includes not just the economic impact losses, but all of the losses that our offices have estimated across the state and that have informed a lot of the recovery efforts. So with that, I'll open the floor for questions. Thank you. So a lot of the data was used for developing a lot of the budget requests for the recovery dollar requests from the federal government. So the damage and needs assessment informed so there was a lot of different requests from the state to the federal government in terms of like the community development block grant for disaster and recovery, for various Army Corps of Engineer requests, aid for disaster recovery, and a lot of other federal programs, as well as allocations for state dollars where the federal government doesn't have programs to help with specific recovery and resiliency efforts. So it's on the OSBM website, and it's something that we worked in partnership with local governments as well. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Paul could probably speak to this more, but I believe the DOT was kind of a central warehouse for a lot of that data, and they were able to share that with us as well. So.
Right. The DOT reports all of that online. They have a TIMS database. Then what was reported, yeah, we can't, right now we're not taking those all into account. That would be something awesome if we could get all of that data. Yeah.
Oh, I think you're first. Yeah. So Orange County was a late designation to to being eligible for individual assistance, and that was the key criteria for that grouping. And that's because on the Monday following the hurricane, there was a really severe line of storms that was from the hurricane that actually dropped, I think, about 5 to 6 inches of rain in just a few hours on Orange, Durham, and Chatham counties. So that didn't necessarily affect the surrounding counties as much. So. Hmm? For the various factors. So, I mean, really it was more of we needed to do things as quickly as possible to try to get those dollars out as fast as possible. From the federal government, a lot of the recovery efforts the award dollars are determined by Congress. So it's, we wanted to make sure that we had that data available as soon as possible, and we were getting that data to our congressional delegation and to federal agencies and the executive branch and on the state side, the General Assembly had already planned to come back by a certain date, so our office worked to make sure that we had, trying to be able to fill the gap between the total damage estimates, what private resources would be able to account for, like insurance and national flood insurance, what the federal government would likely take care of, and then what the gap would be left over that the state share would be. So, and that was by late October. We had the state budget session on Florence. So. All right. Thank you all very much.